Hello. This week I've been messing a lot with the Digitakt II from Elektron. This wasn't provided by Elektron. I don't work with them directly, although what up Elektron if you want to work together. This was provided by Zounds, who have been a huge supporter of the channel with no specific requests. They just send me gear when I want to use it, which is super cool, and I appreciate them forever. So the thing about the Digitakt II, or at least the most important thing to me, is that it essentially solves every problem that I personally had with the Digitakt I. Almost every problem. And the ones it hasn't solved, I think it is capable on a hardware level of solving. So let's talk about what those problems were. So initially, my biggest issue with the Digitakt, the original, was that I felt very limited by mono samples. I think more so than any other component, because of the other types of devices I use and the way I work, mono samples was a huge limitation for me. I understand that there's a huge audience that did not care that it was mono, and to those people I have nothing but respect. I'm glad it worked for them. But for me personally, everything else I use is stereo. My gear generally outputs stereo. Signal chains, whether it be synthesizers, the Machine Plus, Akai Force, any of the MPC devices, all these were stereo devices. And so other than the Poly-N tracker, which I had the exact same complaint about, only being able to work in mono samples, even with the effects you could apply, just felt very limiting and needlessly limiting for me. On top of that, the amount of available storage per project and on the unit itself was extremely limited, and that has been resolved like basically exponentially. Instead of 1 GB of total storage on the device, there's now 20, which compared to some other devices might not sound like enough, but for what a Digitakt is and what the Digitakt does, it is absolutely more than enough for me. And then the per project amount is now 400 megabytes, which again sounds very small, but when you're working with the Digitakt, and other people may use this differently, but when I worked with the Digitakt, I'm generally taking smaller slices of sound and then turning those into components of a larger composition. It's not the same as taking like a really long loop or using the SP404 to have the stems of an entire concert. In the Elektron world, my understanding is the closest analog to that sort of workflow would be the Octatrack, which I haven't used. For the Digitakt, it's more about slices of audio turning into like a collage of a composition. At least that's how I use it, and I think that's how a lot of others use it as well. And so increasing the storage of the device itself and increasing the capabilities from mono to stereo samples alone was huge, but the other thing they did is on the Digitakt original, the top 8 tracks here were audio, and the bottom 8 tracks for MIDI. These can now be either. And so for me, that's awesome because I mostly just want to use audio on here. So now I have 16 tracks of stereo audio, stereo samples. So when you combine those 3 factors, the stereo samples, the 16 available sample slots or tracks here, the fact that parameter locking already existed, which if you don't know, is essentially ways to lock various values per step, because these are step sequencers, the Elektron devices. These red illuminated buttons represent recorded steps of information. And the way I generally play music, including on the Elektron devices, is that I play in real time, which you can totally do. I basically play the pads like an instrument. You can also step record, which is how many people use these devices, and I really think it's cool you can do either. It's not the only device that's like that. The Machine Plus, the MPC, Poly-N's devices are similar. You can step sequence or record. But the reason that I bring up the step sequencing is because even if you record in real time, you can parameter lock values in retrospect. And when you parameter lock, you're not just limited to 16 samples. You're limited to the amount of total available samples in the project. And my understanding is total available sample banks in a project is 128 samples times 8, because they've increased it from just 128 or 127. Whatever the original limitation was. We can look at that right now, actually. 127 times 8, which means that if you're really quick with your parameter locking and you get really in depth, you could select a specific trigger, or trig as they call them. I need to go to a track that actually has trigs. But you could hold a trig and then change the sample played per trig. This is similar to how the Poly-N tracker works, or trackers work in general. In fact, many people have said that the original Digitakt, and by proxy, the Digitakt II, are kind of another way of putting a tracker in a box. They're different, but there's some similarities. Anyway, I don't want to get too weedsy too fast, but the increase in stereo samples, the 16 possible tracks with way more headroom for sample storage per project, and especially on-device storage, because I don't necessarily need 20 gigs or even 1 gig of samples per project, but being limited to just 1 gig on device did feel like a huge limitation for me. I was able to get my entire sample library that I use onto this device in probably 5 or 6 hours. And I will say that's a con, even over USB that uses like a MIDI 1.0 transfer protocol that's like 0.3 Mbps. And so it did take hours and hours to get my samples on here, but it was a drag and drop process and basically a one-time process to get most of those over. And so I'm not gonna hold it too much against it, but it is funny. I hope they could find a way to speed that up, given that they also have overbridge, which is like, not on this device yet, to be fair, but almost all the other Digiboxes have overbridge, which lets you take simultaneous audio tracks out and record them into your DAW or wherever you want. So given that that capability exists over the USB port, I would also hope that faster transfer speeds would be something they could maybe do, but it's really not a deal breaker. And then last but not least is that you'll see there's 8 dots here. On all the other Digiboxes, these are 4 dots, and they represent essentially pages of data and the amount of available length of your step sequence or your total sequence. So basically they represent bars, right? The 4 would be a 4-bar loop, and to all the people who are screaming and commenting, you could do way more than that with multiplication and all this stuff, it's true. It's super true, and I do want to address that. If you hit function and setup, you could change the speed of a pattern so that if you had 64 but you had it at half speed, you basically had 8 bars. But now your default limit is 128 steps at 1 time speed, which also means if you were to half that speed, you'd have a 16-bar loop, for example. And I tend to create my tracks in clip-based workflows with 8-bar loops. Sometimes I'll do less, but in general, my default is 8 bars. It's a really nice amount of time to create variation. On the older Digiboxes and on the Digitakt, for example, which is also a Digibox even without Digi in its name, I would use the half speed, or I would use the conditional triggers. So you could say, play on every second pass to create longer variations. But having it default, or at least be much easier to just have an 8-bar loop, it really does change how I use it in a really positive way, and then means that if I want to go back and add complexity and variation, I have all the flexibility I used to have, but with twice the potential length of a pattern. And so those are pretty much all the big changes that matter to me. There's way more going on, but a lot of the changes are also changes that have happened to the Digitakt I, such as the new machines. Most of those machines, if not all of them, like the grid machine and the warp machine, those exist on the Digitakt I as well, and I really like those. They're relatively new. Red Means Recording, aka Jeremy Blake, he made a video about how exciting that update was that added those machines, but how frustrating it was to have the storage size limitations. So I really hope he's digging this machine if he's trying it out, because I feel like it solved a lot of his problems too. The only problem I really still have with this thing is polyphony. It's a similar problem I have with the Digitakt. It's not per note polyphony. I mean, you can have simultaneous samples, 16 tracks of stereo audio, that's great. But what you can't do is, to my knowledge, easily say, I want these 3 to play the same sample, and then when I go into keyboard mode, I will be triggering all 3 of those at once, combining their voices. So if I want to play chords on device with the samples on those 3 slots, I can just play them and it will write the data per slot, 1 step per slot. I can't figure out how to do that. I don't think it's a built-in feature yet. It seems like something they could do, and it's something the Poly-N tracker does that I really like. Yes, it takes some of your voices, but with 16, or some of your slots rather, some of your tracks. But with 16 tracks, it's way less of a sacrifice to say, I want a 4-note chord to be played by these 4 pads, these 4 slots, and then I still have, 12 other tracks that can be monophonic in polyphony, not in audio. They're stereo audio, but they're mono triggering. I would really like an easy way to group tracks to then record polyphonic MIDI data for the same sample, if that makes sense. Sorry if that's too complex. My workaround for now is just playing chords on external devices and sampling them in, which is totally fine. But I think a lot of the magic of this device comes from getting your audio into it and then messing with it in device. So speaking of messing with audio in device and making stuff, I want to show you and walk you through the most detailed track I've made so far. It's just a beat, but it kind of shows you some of the new features, at least how I've been using them, and it hopefully shows you why I think stereo is such a positive upgrade. I'm in the Elektron Reddit thread a lot, and a lot of people have talked about how some of those first Digitakt II jams that came out, they would be like, why did that have to be a Digitakt II jam? I don't understand where stereo is even at play. Not everything I do in this song that I'm gonna show you required the Digitakt II, but it was a lot easier to make it because I didn't have to worry about 8 tracks of audio limitation. And it also has the stereo width because almost every sample I used is stereo and anything I sampled in was stereo. So it also just has this wider sound stage, I think. It's not something that would be impossible to create on a Digitakt because the Digitakt you can use effects that are stereo to create stereo width to your samples. But on the Digitakt II, not having to worry about that stuff, being able to just take raw stereo data and samples and then sample in stereo makes it so much easier to really get the full expressivity and the full detail out of the samples you're using and what you're putting into it. So to me, that's a huge upgrade, fixed a huge problem I have. So I'll show you the song. I'll walk you through how I built it, the components of it, and then I'll play you the whole thing. Before I do that, I just want to thank everyone so much for liking and subscribing to the channel. It's been a crazy week for the channel. I think we've passed 600, I think like 640 people subscribed in the last 28 days. I had a random iPad Logic Pro video blow up, which I'm so grateful for. So if you are a new subscriber from that video, hi, welcome, thank you so much. To everyone who's checked out my music, those numbers are going up for my album, There's Something Better. It means so much, especially as I work on my second album. It's really cool to see the audience growing for that music. Obviously, you know, my username is Dylan Paris Music when I comment. The channel's called Dylan Paris, but I do make music and I'm a musician first, even if YouTube is kind of what people know me for. So it's really cool to see those two audiences kind of come together and enjoy the music as well as these videos. So thank you so much again to everyone who's liked and subscribed. To Zounds for sending this over. Not sponsored in the sense that they don't require me to make specific videos for the gear. They just send me gear. I can make a video, not make a video. I can say that they sent it. I can not say that they sent it. I think federally I need to say they sent it. I can't remember. But anyway, thank you to Zounds. If you're interested in picking one of these up, I'd recommend using my link because it helps my channel. I get like 18% back or something like that. It's a huge kick. It's wild. But if you can find better deals used elsewhere, or if you're just watching because you want to see how this gear works and you have no interest in buying it, that's super cool too. Thanks for stopping by. Let's check out this song. Oh yeah, I guess the only other thing it doesn't have that I think would be cool is a battery, but you can't get everything, I guess. And I think there's ways to work around that. Okay, so let's walk through this first project. This is the first loop. This is like the intro or the first verse. And I don't think any of these are built-in samples. I think they're all from my own personal library. I've got this kick. This sample is a bass drum. This is a snare with a few things going on. I reduced the release or the decay on this, so if you hold it, that's the sample. But a lot of the hits are actually short when I played them, so it'd be like boom, boom. Let's see what effects. This has overdrive, bit reduction. I got really into bit reduction on this track. This one doesn't have any effects. This one does. I don't think I used 3. Maybe I did. Let's see. Sample 3. Yeah. This is a clap. I definitely used this. This is a string sample from a pack. It's like Elegant Strings. I love using these. And I did a fair number of things with this. So first thing you'll notice is this is a grid machine. And I've split it into 16. And when you're in the keyboard mode, you can play it sliced. So when people say that Digitakt doesn't have sample slicing, I think that's true in the sense you can't like lazy chop and choose where your slices are the same way as you can on like an MPC or the Octatrack or most gear. But the grid machine gets me most of the way I need to be. If I load up a drum-based loop or whatever, I can chop that using grid and generally get to the point where each pad is a note. And then for cutting strings, yeah, I just basically set it to 16, single length, forward play. Not a ton, no filter work here, but I did bit reduction, delay, reverb, and chorus. I didn't mention this, but chorus is new on the 2. And I like it. I like having chorus here. I also have sample rate reduction and no mod routing for this version, but in other patterns, there's mod routing, like LFO routing for this sample. And some pitch changes. I did pitch this a little bit. I tuned it down. All right. I didn't use these 3 on this version of the loop. This I recorded indirectly, I believe. Oh, actually, no, sorry. This is a sample from a pack. It's just a synth. I added reverb, delay, chorus, a little bit of overdrive, and no LFO routing. This is a bass sound. This has no effects on it, and it is also from the same pack as this note. I think these are default, and I think I'm not using them. These are like the default tracks that load up. For pattern 1, I didn't use these. Yeah, they're not lighting up. They're not in use. For the next pattern, This is essentially the first chorus. There's a little bit more going on. So I believe I sampled this in. Oh no, sorry, this is Mr. Hudson. I don't want to take credit for that. This is Mr. Hudson's tonal, and then there's a lot of effects going. So we've got some sample rate reduction, I believe, delay, reverb, chorus, and we're running an LFO on panning on the frequency of the filter, and that's it. You can see the filter here. It's a low pass. Oh yeah, and this is a one-shot machine. This sample is a warp playing in reverse, 4 bars, 8 segments or 8 segments. Bit reduction, overdrive, sample rate, a lot of reverb. We're LFO on the frequency here, and sample rate reduction, and that's it for this. Okay, yeah, so these two are added, and it sounds like this. And for a while, these are the only two patterns I had. 1 and 2 are 9 and 10 as they are in this bank. Everything I've done so far is in this single project because there's a ton of patterns per bank and there's a ton of banks. The project sample pool is huge, so not a problem. All right, but then I did decide, hey, let's make a more varied verse. So I'll play that for you first and then tell you what I added, basically. Okay, so now we have this note. I believe I recorded from the Astrolab. Yeah, anything with like an auto name I recorded. So this is an Astrolab note that I played. You can see the notes are right next to each other. And originally I tried to record it live like that, where it'd be like, but when I tried to do that, it actually just recorded just one of them. So I recorded back to back, and then I brought the notes really close to each other. Let me get out of this window. If we go to this trig, you can see I basically move the timing so they're really close when you hear them. We'll see this here too. And that give it this like this like twinkliness. Additionally, there's a lot of delay, reverb, chorus, a little bit of bit reduction, sample rate reduction, no LFO on this. This is, I think, a default sound I didn't use. This is a full sample I recorded in. So I just played this in from the Astrolab. I used the threshold recording so that I could listen to the loop and then just start playing because it was armed and it just recorded the sample. There are effects here, so there's a lot of delay, reverb, a little bit of chorus, and bit reduction, and we're LFO affecting the frequency. That's it for this version. And that's about it, except for the strings now, I mentioned I changed them later, we're LFO affecting the frequency and the sample rate reduction, and I actually only play that part, so this part you hear, dun 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 dun, only plays 1 bar and then doesn't play for the second during the verses. Okay, so then I made a new chorus. This is what that sounds like. Oh, 1 second. Okay, so this is Keen Divider. This is, I think, also sampled from the Astrolab. It is a 1-shot. It's got FX routing, amp panning, and bit reduction on the LFO. a little bit of a slower attack. The filter is basically a high pass filter. And a ton of effects, a lot of delay. This is the one that's on 16 on the verse, so it's just a high-pitched guy there. Frequency affecting, that's it. A lot of effects routing. So, somewhere around here is a top loop. Here we go. This is a top loop that is then on the stretch machine, because originally it's a much faster like drum and bass loop. And this is one of the only times in the track where I kind of just take someone's loop, pitch it down, and just play it over. That's not usually how I do stuff, so I try to affect it, right? So we have frequency affecting on the LFO, delay, reverb, and we're filtering it pretty heavily. I then bring that top loop into the second verse, or the third verse, and it sounds like this. And finally, we have the big outro chorus, and there's a little bit of different stuff going on here. So I pitch up pretty dramatically the string sample. I've got panning, resonance, and frequency on the LFO. The way the filter's set up, it's almost more of a high pass filter now. And I affected the bass width as well. So there's 2 filters per track, right? So if I click down into the other one, I've reduced a bunch of the low end. And there's way more delay, way more overdrive, way more sample rate reduction, way more everything basically on the effects. So that's one thing you may notice. And then you may also notice there's more drums. This is a drum loop that I have used the grid machine on to chop up. And I believe this is a Mr. Hudson sample. Yep, it's a Mr. Hudson drum loop that I am just kind of doing, I take some of the low end out and some of the high end. And there's a fair bit of delay on it, some overdrive, some sample rate reduction, and those layers come together in conjunction with the other layers to create this final outro. So those are all the pieces, and this is really fun to make. And I hope you can hear like the stereo width and all of that, but now that you've seen all the pieces and I've walked through it step by step, I'm gonna actually play the whole song for you, or the whole track, the whole beat, and you can kind of decide, is it cool, is it whack? Totally up to you. I like it though, and that, in the words of Tyler, the Creator, I made it for me. If I like it, that's all that matters. I think Rick Rubin feels the same way, so good company. But I hope you like it too, because I'm still kind of vain. All right, let me change my angle and play the song for you. Okay, if you're a Digitakt expert, then you probably already know there's a lot more I could be doing and a lot more I have to learn. But hopefully this was a cool, informative, educational, I don't know, excursion into the Digitakt II. And yeah, like I said earlier, thank you so much to everyone who's liked and subscribed, to everyone who's checked out my album. I'll catch you soon. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. All right, peace.